right, it's everyone's favorite time of their homework docket, watching a video lecture on AP economics. Today we're talking about 2.6 and 2.7. 2.6 is equilibrium and consumer slash producer surplus, and 2.7 is about the changing of that equilibrium. 2.7, super duper review, so we're going to just tag that on the end and hopefully not make too long of a video. Here we go. So equilibrium, what is it? Well, you already know what equilibrium is. It's where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. You also know that the market doesn't always stay there, right? There are all kinds of outside factors that are always creating small surpluses or small shortages. We see it in the marketplace all of the time when there's something you really want to buy and none of it's in stock, or when there's so much of something that it goes on discount or clearance, right? So the market is always adjusting to try and find its equilibrium. So we know that the equilibrium will be found where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied at the intersection of the curves right here. So I'll have a price of something like 350 and a quantity somewhere around 30. But sometimes the price is too high. If the price is too high, like way up here at $5, then the quantity supplied will be really high. Quantity supplied, that's that upward sloping there, where it intersects that supply, will be at about 50. But the amount demanded at that price, because it's a high price, is going to be very low. Consumers don't want to pay that much, and so it might be at 10. That creates a surplus of 40 units. So what happens is that surplus starts to push the prices down. When prices start to go down, suppliers will supply less, and quantity demanded will start to rise as demanders are willing to pay that lower price until we meet at the equilibrium, right? There's also the potential that the price goes too low. If the price is too low, it creates a shortage. The shortage will not persist though, because producers will see that low price and the shortage and they'll start to produce more. So here, at this low price of like $2, we only have 10 people that want this. That's their quantity, or I'm sorry, 10 businesses that are supplying it. Their quantity supplied on the supply curve there because it's so low. They're not going to make a lot of profit. But everybody wants it. We're all the way up here at like 75, close to 80. So huge shortage. That shortage is going to push the prices up as people continue to bid prices up. When prices rise, suppliers are going to start supplying more and more and more, and demanders with that increased price are going to demand less and less and less until we wind up where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. We know we are always, always moving towards equilibrium. Surplus pushes price down, a shortage pushes price up. Okay, you know that already. So I'm going to introduce you to a new term, and that new term will help us understand two other terms as well. So we're getting all termy up here in AP economics. So the term is called voluntary exchange, and it describes something that we all experience every day. The transaction only occurs if both parties agree. You cannot compel somebody to purchase something. In fact, it's against the law, right? You can't like lock the doors and say you don't get out unless you buy this whatever. In fact, that would be considered kidnapping and you'll go to jail. So you can't do it. Two people have to agree in order for a transaction to happen. The person buying it or purchasing it has to agree to pay that price. The person selling it has to agree to sell it at that price. And if they don't agree on a price and a quantity, then that good is not going to be bought or sold. You experience the voluntary exchange the most if you've ever gone through, maybe with your parents or maybe on your own, and tried to purchase a car. When purchasing a car, there's this back and forth. The supplier knows, or the car dealership knows what price they're trying to get. The demander pretty much knows what price they're willing to pay, and then there's a negotiation between the two. It is only if those two agree that the car is actually going to be bought and sold, right? So let's say a consumer walks in and says, okay, I'm not spending any more than $20,000 on a car. Not going to do it. That is my cap. That's what I'm willing to spend. The seller, looking at that same car, is willing to sell it for no less than $15,000 in order to maximize profits. There's a little bit of wiggle room. The consumer's willing to pay 20, the seller's willing to take 15, but of course the seller wants to push that price up because he wants more profit, and the buyer wants to push that price down because the buyer wants more utility, right? So the difference between those two. Now let's say they agree on a price of exchange of $18,000. Voluntary exchange. What is the consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is going to be $2,000. Catch it. She was willing to pay $20,000, but she only had to pay $18,000. So $2,000 that she thought she was going to have to spend on the car, she doesn't have to spend on the car anymore. That's considered consumer surplus. What about producer surplus? Well, the producer was willing to sell it for 15,000, but didn't have to sell it for 15,000. He sold it for 18,000. So even though he was willing to accept 15, he got 3,000 extra bucks in this exchange. We call that producer surplus. And if it's a true, pure, efficient marketplace, then total surplus is going to be maximized. And this exchange is always going to result in both consumer and producer surplus. Both of them are going to win, which is why they agree on the voluntary exchange. Okay? Oh, let's break those two terms down that we were talking about. Consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is a difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. Think of it as your maximum price that you're willing to pay minus the price that you actually pay. Buyer's maximum minus the price you actually pay. Okay? That's always going to be a consumer surplus. So if I was willing to buy that pair of shoes for $100 and I got them on sale for $70, my consumer surplus is $30. If I was willing to buy lunch for $10 and then I was able to get it for $2, then my consumer surplus is $8. Difference between what I was willing to pay and what I actually paid, consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the same. It's a difference between the price the seller receives versus how much they were willing to sell it for. In other words, it's the price they actually sold it for minus their minimum price. The price they're willing to sell it for, or the price that they actually sold it for, sorry, the actual selling price minus the minimum they were willing to accept. Actual selling price minus the minimum. So if they're like, hey, I'm going to take no less than $30 for this shirt that I'm selling, right? No less than $30. But they're able to get somebody to buy it for $50. Well, the price they sold it for was $50. They're willing to accept as little as $30. So the difference there is $20. They got 20 bonus dollars in their pocket. So that's producer surplus and consumer surplus. Let's throw it on a graph, shall we? Okay. So on this graph right here, we know our equilibrium is at $20 and our quantity is 30. How do we identify consumer surplus? Well, no, consumers are represented by the demand curve right here, right? Let me get a little marker here. This demand curve represents consumers, so equals con. And so at maybe 1 unit of this, there's a demander out there. If we dash this all the way up, there's a demander out there that's willing to pay $34 for this good, right? That one person. They're crazy, they're weird, but they really want this and they're willing to pay a high price for it. Money's no object. Do they have to pay that $34? No, they don't. In fact, they pay $20, just like everybody else. So $34 I was willing to pay. I only pay 20. The difference between those two is my consumer surplus right here. So my consumer surplus there, if this was 34, would be $14, right? If you're tracking along with me. 10 people are willing to spend 30, right? Do they have to spend $30? The answer is no. They're willing to spend 30, but they don't have to. They actually pay 20. So that distance there is going to be their consumer surplus, those 10. So it's going to be 30 minus 20 or $10 per person, which would be 10 times 10 or 100. Okay. I jump up here to 20 at 20, or I'm sorry, at a price of $25. 20 people are willing to buy it at that price. It includes all the people before. It includes the first person who's willing to pay 34. It includes all 10 people who are willing to pay 10. Now we have a quantity of 20 people willing to pay 25. Do they have to pay 25? No, they do not. They pay 20. The difference there is the $5. $5 times 20, we have $100 of consumer surplus there, and on it goes. Do you know that the demand curve represents consumers or the consumer interest, and that at every point it represents how much they're willing to pay versus how much they actually pay? Then you'll start to see a very clear picture of how to identify consumer surplus on one of these graphs. I'm going to get rid of this. So if I'm looking at it here, consumer surplus looks like this. You actually don't have to chart it out like I just did. It's below demand, above price. Below demand, above price. Below demand, above price. And it's cut off at the quantity of 30 because that's the only units that are being bought and sold. Cannot go to 40 or 50 or 60. So it's going to be this little top triangle here. That represents all the people are willing to pay versus what they actually pay. They're willing to pay somewhere between $35 and $21, but none of them have to pay those. They pay 20 instead. So all of the consumers have varying levels of consumer surplus. Now, somebody who's willing to only pay $15 for this, they're out of the market, right? Over here, they're out. They were willing to pay 15. They have to pay 20. They're not willing to do that. They don't buy or sell. So we will never extend past the quantity being consumed. We will never extend past the quantity being consumed. Okay, what about producer surplus? Well, we know supply represents the interests of the producers. And at this point, maybe at like 1 unit, this producer is willing to, one producer maybe, is willing to sell this good for $10. Maybe they can do it super cheaply, or they have an abundance of them, or they're really efficient, or they just don't care about profit all that much, whatever. But they're willing to sell it for $10. Do they have to sell it for $10? No, they sell it for $20. The difference between what they're willing to sell it for versus what they sell it for is $10. So that one person is going to get $10 of producer surplus. At 10 units, there are 10 people or 10 producers that are willing to supply at maybe like $14, right? So they're willing to sell it for 14. Few more jump into that because, it's a higher price. Few more can get the profits there. That's reasonable. Do they have to sell it for 14 though, even though they're willing to? No, they sell it for 20. So the difference there is $6 of producer surplus for each of those individual businesses. At a quantity of 20, they're willing to supply 20 if the price is somewhere like $17, for example. But they don't have to sell it for 20. They sell it, or for 17, they sell it for 20. So they have $3 of producer surplus for each of those individuals. On and on and on it goes. There are individuals, businesses that are willing to produce and sell for a lower price than the actual selling price. Now, let's say there's a business that says, you know what? I'm only going to do it if the price is at $25, right? In fact, there's a lot of them that would do it at $25. Are those people going to be a part of the market? No, they are not. They're not in the market. They're willing to sell it for a minimum of 25. Market price is 20. They're priced out, right? They're not going to be able to sell their goods at that high price. So put it all together, and you have producer surplus looks like this: below price, above supply. Below price, above supply. If you remember, consumer surplus is below demand, above price, and that producer surplus is below price, above supply, then no matter how complicated this gets, you are going to be able to identify consumer and producer surplus, which will get you a lot of nice points on the AP microeconomics exam. Now, can you calculate these things? Well, of course you can. Can you calculate consumer surplus at a price of $20? Well, yeah, you've got a triangle here. So all you have to do is take your height, which is 35 minus 20, or 15, and take your base, which is 0 to 30 of this triangle. That's your base right there. And it's 1/2 of that, so that's 15. 1/2 base times height is how you calculate a triangle. So that's going to be 225. Can you calculate producer surplus at $20? Well, of course you can. Again, we have our height here, which is 20 to 10, or 10. Our base is still 30. 1/2 of that is 15. So 10 times 15 is 150. Just calculating the area of triangles. Not so bad, right? And then what about total surplus? Well, that's just going to be those two together. So 225 plus 150. Our total surplus is this giant triangle here. Consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is going to be 375. And that's about as bad as it gets here through the answers there. Okay, moving on. So assume that only 10 units is produced instead of 30. We were producing 30, but for some reason, price ceiling or a price floor, only 10 units are being produced. Well, that chops off a big part of our market. In fact, I always think of this as a chopper because we call this dead area over here dead weight loss, right? Dead weight loss. So at this point, it's not going to be a part of it at all. Our price is $20 still. Equilibrium price still stands. So my price is at $20 here. My price is at $20, then I just do below demand, above price. That would be my consumer surplus. Now change color. And we go above supply, below price. And that's going to be my producer surplus. I can still calculate those things. I have a triangle here. I have two squares. I calculate the area of those individual shapes, and that will give me consumer surplus and producer surplus. Later on, we'll show you what happens when you have a price ceiling or a price floor, but we're just going to assume that this quantity is cut off. Keep in mind, you cannot have consumer surplus or producer surplus of units that haven't been bought and sold. 20 and 30, you can't do it. They are cut off from the market. So we call this area over here. Here, let me use a different color. We call that area dead weight loss. And if you think of that quantity as sort of a chopper, like chopping off a piece of the finger or chopping off the market, that market is dead. It used to be a part of consumer surplus, then the little wedge between demand and supply, but it is no longer a part of demand and supply. That's dead weight loss. How do you calculate that? Well, you've got a base, you got a height, right? You know your base is 30 all the way down here to, let's just say that's 15. I think that's where that was supposed to cut off. And we have a height, and that height is 10 to 30. So that's going to be 15 times 10 to 30 is 20. 20 divided by 2 is 10, 1/2 base times height, right? So 15 times 10 will give me a dead weight loss of 150. So if ever the quantity isn't at equilibrium quantity, it's going to chop off the market for whatever reason. It's going to chop it off. You have dead weight loss. Dead weight loss is always a part of, used to be a part of surplus, but is not anymore. It's been cut off because of the quantity being produced is less than equilibrium quantity. Okay, let's keep going. All right, that's 2.6. 2.7, we know this already, changes in equilibrium. I'm going to blaze through this and we'll touch it in class again. We know that things that change equilibrium are determinants or shifters of the curves, either one of the curves. So let's say there's a new grilling technology that cuts production time in half. What's going to happen here for hamburgers? Well, supply is going to go to the right. It makes it easier to produce, which means that the price is going to fall and the quantity is going to rise. We have a new equilibrium right here. Okay, let's say the price of chicken sandwiches, which is a substitute of hamburgers, increases. If chicken sandwiches are more expensive, are people going to demand more or less of hamburgers if they're substitutes? Of course, they're going to demand more. So demand will shift to the right. The price will increase. The quantity will increase. You know how this works. New equilibrium. Let's say the price of a hamburger falls from $3 to $1. What's going to happen here? Well, if the current equilibrium price was $3 and went down to 1, it actually is not going to shift the curve at all. Remember, a change in price does not shift the curve. That's going to be movement along the curve. So now we're going to have a lower price. At this low price, you're going to have a high increase in quantity demanded, a significant decrease in quantity supplied because of that low price. As a result, you're going to have a shortage between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. We call that disequilibrium. Okay. Let's say the price of ground beef triples. What's going to happen there? Well, supply must be shifting to the left. Very good. It's a ground beef is a resource used to produce hamburgers. So when it goes up in price, the supply will shift left because businesses will have less profit in producing it, which results in an increase in price and a decrease in quantity. Let's say there's human fingers found in multiple burger restaurants. What's going to happen there? I think this is the second time I've talked about chopping off fingers in one video. It's a little disturbing. Well, if that's happening, clearly as a change in taste, people will not want to eat at those restaurants anymore. So demand is going to shift to the left, which results in a decrease in price and quantity at that new equilibrium. What happens if demand and supply increase simultaneously? Well, demand will shift to the right and supply will shift to the right. resulting in a definite increase in quantity, but we actually don't know what's going to happen with price. It looks like price stays the same, but price went up and then price went down. So we call price indeterminate. If it's going up and then down at the same time, we don't know if it's actually going to increase or decrease. Okay, try this question out. Pause the video and see how you do. Yeah, you're right there. Okay. In a perfectly competitive market, which of the following shifts in the supply and demand curves will definitely cause equilibrium price and quantity to decrease? The only thing that causes both price and quantity to go down is going to be the shift left in demand. So E is going to be your correct answer there. All right, that's it, friends. Jump over to Khan Academy and check out 2.6 through 2.7, consumer and producer surplus and allocative efficiency, and I will see you soon. Peace.